Digital combat systems performance has always been something of a quest for me. Even very powerful systems have difficulty rendering the game world with fluency. My personal problem is compounded by the Dell U3011 30-inch monitor I see Georgia through. With a native resolution of 2560 by 1600, my system has to push 4.1 million pixels per frame. Ideally, I'd like for it to do that 60 times a second to match the monitor's refresh rate. Actually, I'd like for it to do so 70 times a second so that I can activate VSync and eliminate screen tearing. That's a tall order.
Pull up.
This footage is with all systems pegged to their max in the Options tab. All options to high or enabled, MFDs to 1024 every frame, MSAA set to 16xq, and all of the other settings maxed out or enabled. As you can see here, my system, an i7 2600K at 4.4 GHz and a pair of HD 7970 3GB cards in Crossfire simply cannot muster the power to run DCS World A10C at max settings. Not that I would need to. Fraps tells the tale like this. Just flying level at about 2,500 feet, my system can manage about 25 FPS, but any sort of activity such as attacking ground targets results in spikes downward that make controlling the aircraft difficult and visually unpleasant. Waypoint 3 in attack with rockets and guns brings the system almost to a standstill. The game becomes a 5 frames per second slideshow at that point. Matters return to a pokey but manageable 22 FPS once I start toward Waypoint 4, a bridge target. Clearly, compromises must be made. So, I would ideally like to run at native resolution with a little bit of MSAA in order to smooth things out. I would like to have most of the eye candy, but at 2560 by 1600 a fair number of sacrifices have to be made. I've chosen some of what I consider to be superfluous image quality settings and opted out of them. Here's what these settings look like. Pretty handsome.
Pull up.
Edges are generally smooth, though some jaggedness is still apparent. It runs fairly smoothly, and to be honest I don't have too many complaints, but I'm on a quest for the best, and forget the rest. With a system like mine, I want the best without too many compromises. As you can see, even an i7 2600K overclocked at 4.4 GHz and a pair of HD 7970s in Crossfire cannot push 2560 by 1600 with any MSAA fluently, that is to say above 60 FPS. What you can see here is though we start off at about 60 FPS, performance decreases, especially when engaging ground targets and activating the air-to-ground mode on the MFD. My system comes close, but cannot quite deliver desired performance at 2560 by 1600 with MSAA. The next logical step is to see if my HD 7970s have anything more in them. My CPU is already maxed out at 4.4 GHz. I didn't get a super chip by luck of the draw. I can take my cards from 925 MHz core clock, 1375 MHz memory clock, to 1025 1500 by altering these settings in the Catalyst Control Center. Obviously I take these risks upon myself, but I've had these cards for a couple of years and I've already tested them up to this level in other titles without harm. It's obvious that the same smoothness is evident as before, without any added artifacts caused by overclocking my video cards. The sim is a real pleasure to fly with a competent system. You can do things that you cannot do with a lesser system because your control inputs are that much more precise. The sim is, however, forgiving and can be played down to about 30 FPS. Higher frame rates are a bonus and really make a difference. Though the overclocked HD 7970s turn in slightly higher performance, and the additional speed helps to mitigate some of the spikes while attacking ground targets and activating air-to-ground mode, even a pair of HD 7970 GHz edition equivalents cannot deliver 60 FPS performance at 2560 by 1600 with 2x MSAA. The good news is that frame time variance, a recurring problem with AMD cards, especially in Crossfire, is largely under control, except under periods of exceptional load. The next step is to submit to the reality of the situation and disable MSAA. The hope is that the overclocked HD 7970s will have enough horsepower to provide the 60 FPS I've been looking for. The image quality is every bit as good as with 2x MSAA, except that lines are jagged, especially at low angles such as especially visible where the cockpit frames intersect with the sky. The sim feels quite smooth, and it's apparent from looking up at the upper left-hand corner at the Dxtry FPS display that my system is frequently pushing more than 60 frames per second. Not quite. This is what I'll have to settle with if I insist on running DCS A10C at the native resolution of my monitor, and as a theoretical high, it works. However, there's no overhead for multiplayer or for larger object counts. The next step is to reduce resolution and see what happens. As expected, the image quality is the same as 2560 by 1600, and perhaps a little smoother. I'm getting pretty good at these particular targets, so consistency and performance for benchmarking is pretty solid. An annoying thing about this resolution, which is not shown here in this video, is that 2048 by 1536 is pillar boxed on the sides, with the image occupying a square at the center of my monitor. To show you what this means, take a look here at this short clip I took here with my cell phone camera. You can see that the sides of the monitor are not used. This is a minor thing, a factor of this particular resolution, and something you're just going to have to accept if you want to use this resolution for increased performance. Here we see solid 60 frames per second performance, minus moments of intense ground attack where performance dips but still stays above 20 FPS. Frame time variance remains well under control, except at certain times related to exceptional load. My general lack of skill aside, these segments of footage at 1920 by 1200 resolution appear quite similar in terms of image quality to 2560 by 1600. There's some pronounced jaggedness to all lines, however, and I'll be wanting to look at some form of anti-aliasing to correct it. This, however, is offset by the increased smoothness of the sim's performance at this resolution. Whereas Crossfired HD 7970s were struggling to really manage DCS A10C at 2560 at 1600, they are well able to handle it at 1920 by 1200. As with 2048 by 1536, solid 60 FPS performance, but what's surprising here is how little dropping down to 1920 by 1200 gains in terms of improvement. I would have expected that the drop from 2560 by 1600 to 1920 by 1200 would have obtained more than a 3 FPS improvement. This is kind of disappointing. I had been hoping that a slight drop in resolution coupled with some anti-aliasing might yield identical image quality with improved frame rates. Though this is a pretty extreme measure to take, I decided to go down to 1680 by 1050 resolution to see what would result. The image quality I see here is certainly playable, but stretching 1680 by 1050 to a 30-inch 2560 by 1600 monitor is quite a step down from the lofty heights I'd hoped to achieve. That said, the sim is not less playable, just less pleasurable. Effectiveness is its own virtue, however, and if by decreasing resolution you can be a more apt pilot and an asset to your team, then by all means do what is necessary to meet your mission. However, clearly, reducing resolution is doing nothing to improve performance on my system. For my troubles, I actually see a slight performance drop. By what I see here, I determine that DCS A10C is bound by the system's CPU power and clock speed rather than GPU capacity. This makes sense as DCS shares some base design similarities with another famously CPU-dependent title with very large terrain sets, ARMA. Another strategy is going to be necessary, one that involves going into the settings a little more deeply. That's going to have to wait, however, as this has taken up my entire evening. Suffice to say that you can't change your resolution or overclock your GPU to get the performance you want out of DCS World. I'm going to have to make some more compromises to achieve 60 frames per second. Thanks for watching. Part 2 is coming soon.